I woke up gasping for air. Dirt filled my mouth, my nose, my eyes. My lungs screamed as I clawed at the earth above me, fingers scraping against something hard. Wood. A coffin. I was inside a coffin. Panic surged through my veins like ice water. My nails bent and cracked as I beat against the wood, my muffled screams swallowed by the suffocating darkness. My body convulsed, muscles spasming as I fought against the impossible weight pressing down on me. I was dead. I knew I was dead. I remembered the gunshot, the sharp explosion of pain in my chest. The man's face, the one who killed me, was the last thing I saw before everything turned black. And yet, here I was. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of decay. My own. I didn't know. Every breath burned my lungs, and the pressure on my skull made it feel like my head would cave in at any moment. My heart thundered in my chest, alive and defiant. Then a noise, a rustling above me. Something was moving, scraping, digging. The wooden lid above me cracked, and light, pale bluish light, poured in through the splintered hole. My breath hitched. A skeletal hand, its fingers too long, too sharp, reached through the gap. The nails clicked against the wood as they searched for me. I screamed, pushing myself back against the coffin's base, but there was nowhere to go. The fingers found my shirt, curling into the fabric. And then, the wood shattered. I was yanked from my grave, dirt spilling into my mouth as I was dragged upward. The ground tore away from me in chunks, and I burst into the cold night air, choking, gasping, my limbs flailing. The hand that pulled me up was gone. I collapsed onto damp soil, sucking in breath after breath, trembling with disbelief. My heart pounded. I was alive. But I shouldn't have been. I forced myself to sit up. Around me stretched an endless field of sunflowers, their stalks impossibly tall, their heads a deep, unnatural shade of blue. They swayed gently, though there was no wind. I turned to look at my grave. The earth was still disturbed, a deep hole gaping where I'd been buried. But the thing that had pulled me free was nowhere to be seen. Something was very, very wrong. Then I heard the voice. "You're back." It was hoarse, rasping, like someone who hadn't spoken in a long time. My stomach twisted as I turned toward the sound. A man stood at the edge of the field, barely visible in the darkness. His clothes were tattered, his skin pale and stretched thin over his bones. But it was his eyes that froze me in place. They were hollow, empty, dead. I knew that face. It was the man who had killed me. I couldn't move, every muscle in my body locked up as I stared at him. He was the last person I saw before I died. The man who had pulled the trigger, the reason I had felt that searing, unbearable pain in my chest. My mind screamed at me to run, to fight, to do anything. But I just sat there, trembling, as the blue sunflowers swayed around me. The man took a slow step forward. His clothes were ragged, his skin stretched too tightly over his gaunt face. There was something wrong with him, something profoundly unnatural. His hollow eyes were sunken deep into his skull, black and empty, like looking into an abyss. "You're back," he repeated, his voice dry and cracked, as if it had been an eternity since he had last spoken. I scrambled backward, hands digging into the damp soil. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. "You!" My voice broke, hoarse and unfamiliar to my own ears. "You shot me. I was dead." The man let out a rattling sigh. "I know." The way he said it sent ice through my veins. He didn't sound victorious or regretful, just tired. I forced myself to my feet, legs wobbling beneath me. The sky overhead was a dull, endless grey, neither night nor day. The field stretched endlessly in every direction, the eerie blue sunflowers towering over me, their dark centers seeming to watch. The air was heavy with the scent of soil, damp and cloying, as if it had just rained, but the ground was dry. "What the hell is this place?" I asked, my voice shaking. The man ran a hand over his face, as if trying to wake himself from a dream. "It's where we all end up." I didn't like the way he said "we." My fingers dug into my arms, trying to ground myself, to make sense of the impossible. "You buried me," I whispered. "I remember the dirt. I remember the pain." The man nodded, his movements slow, deliberate. "Yes, and now you're back." Anger flared in my chest, burning through the confusion. "You killed me," I snarled. "Why the hell would you—" "You don't understand." His voice was sharper now, but not angry, just resigned. I was trying to stop it. I shook my head, taking a step away from him. "Stop what?" The man gestured toward the field. "The cycle." The word sent a chill down my spine. I looked around again, taking in the endless sunflowers, the shifting sky, the stillness that felt so unnatural. My grave sat open behind me, the hole gaping like a wound in the earth. "What do you mean, cycle?" I asked. The man exhaled slowly. "You think this is the first time?" A cold, creeping dread settled into my bones. I swallowed hard. "The first time for what?" His empty eyes locked onto mine. "That you've died." The words hit me like a blow to the gut. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. I remembered dying. The gunshot, the pain, the darkness. But that was it. There was nothing before that. My memories felt hazy, incomplete, like pages torn from a book. I knew things. I knew my own name. I knew how to speak. I knew what the world was supposed to look like. But I couldn't remember anything before him. A sick feeling churned in my stomach. "That's not possible." The man sighed, looking past me into the distance. "I thought the same thing once." A silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then he spoke again. "I woke up just like you did, gasping for air, clawing through the dirt." He reached up, pressing a bony hand to his temple, and someone was waiting for me. I swallowed. "Who?" His expression darkened. "The man who killed me." A sharp chill ran down my spine. "I was buried in this field," he continued, "just like you. When I woke up, he was here, telling me the same thing I'm telling you now. That this place isn't real. That this isn't the first time I died. That I was trapped." His gaze locked onto mine. I didn't believe him. The words sent a sickening shudder through my body. I tried to deny it, to tell myself that this was just some bizarre hallucination, that I had somehow survived and been left to rot in this godforsaken place. But something deep inside me knew he was telling the truth. I could feel it. A horrible, gnawing certainty. "How long?" My voice was barely above a whisper. "How long have I been here?" The man's lips parted slightly, his face twisted with something almost like pity. 30 days. I felt the blood drain from my face. "No." I shook my head. "That's not possible. I tried to think, to remember, to pull anything from my mind that could contradict him. But there was nothing. Just scattered fragments, echoes of a life that felt distant, almost unreal. The man took another step toward me, his presence looming. "This place, it doesn't let go," he said. "Every time you die, you come back here, again and again." I forced down the bile rising in my throat. "So how do we get out?" His expression darkened. "I don't know." A crushing silence fell between us. I looked around, at the blue sunflowers swaying in the non-existent wind, at the endless sky that never seemed to change, at the yawning grave behind me. A thought slithered into my mind, unwanted and horrible. "What if I don't do anything?" I asked, barely able to say the words. "What if I just stay here?" The man let out a hollow, humorless laugh. "You think I haven't tried?" A new kind of dread settled into my bones. I felt it then, a deep, unsettling presence lingering just at the edge of my perception, a sensation of being watched. I turned my head slightly, peering through the sunflowers. For a split second, I thought I saw something moving between the stalks. A shape, a shadow. And then it was gone. My pulse thundered in my ears. "There's something else here," I whispered. The man's face tightened. "I know." The air around us felt heavier now, thicker, as if the world itself was pressing in. He turned to me, his expression grim. "This place doesn't want you to leave." I swallowed hard. "Then we make it let us." His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to argue, but then he stopped. A flicker of something almost like hope passed through his hollow eyes. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "You'd better be ready to fight." I clenched my fists. I didn't know what waited for us in the depths of this field. But whatever it was, I wasn't going to let it win. A cold wind whispered through the field, rustling the blue sunflowers like a chorus of hushed voices. The man, my killer, my guide, whatever he was, stood rigid, his hollow eyes fixed on something beyond the rows of flowers. I followed his gaze, my breath shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't see anything, not really, but I could feel it. Something was out there, watching, waiting. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look at me. "I don't know, but it's always been here." A thick silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken dread. I forced myself to swallow, my throat dry and raw. "You said you don't know how to escape," I said. "But have you tried?" His jaw tightened. "Of course I've tried." I waited, but he didn't say more. Frustration bubbled in my chest. Then what happened? He exhaled slowly. "Every time I tried to leave, I ended up back here. No matter what I did, no matter how far I ran, it always brings me back." The words sent a cold shiver through me. I turned, looking around again, at the endless rows of blue sunflowers stretching into infinity. Their dark centers seemed to stare at me, empty and unblinking. The ground beneath my feet was damp, cold, but when I bent down to touch it, it felt wrong, not like dirt, more like something alive, something that pulsed beneath my fingertips. I jerked my hand away. "We can't just stay here," I said. The man's hollow eyes flicked toward me. "You think I don't know that?" His voice was edged with something bitter. "I spent the first cycle trying to run, the second trying to hide, the third trying to kill whatever's out there." He paused, exhaling sharply. None of it worked. A creeping sense of dread curled in my stomach. "But something is out there," I said, my voice quieter now. "Something is watching us." The man nodded slowly. A rustling noise made me freeze. It was close, too close. We weren't alone. I turned sharply, my eyes scanning the field. The sunflowers swayed in slow, unnatural movements, bending as if something unseen was moving through them. Then, a shadow, just for a second. A flicker of something tall, wrong, its form twisting, its limbs too long. Then it was gone. I staggered back, my pulse hammering. "Did you see that?" The man's expression darkened. "I saw it." My breathing turned shallow. "What is that thing?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "It's what comes when you don't run." My blood turned to ice. The sunflowers shifted, rustling in that same unnatural way. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it moving, circling us. I turned to the man. "What happens if it catches us?" He exhaled. "You die." I frowned. "I already died." He shook his head. "Not like that." A low sound echoed through the field, a distant, distorted noise, like a breath drawn through broken lungs. I took a step back. "We have to go." The man hesitated. "There's nowhere to go." The sunflowers shifted again, closer this time. I grabbed his arm. "Then we need to move. Now." For a second I thought he would resist, but then, slowly, he nodded. We ran. The sunflowers slapped against my skin as I pushed through them, their thick stems bending unnaturally. The ground felt wrong beneath my feet, soft, too soft, like something waiting to give way. Behind us, the noise grew louder, a low, rattling breath, something huge moving through the field. My lungs burned as I ran, my fingers tearing through the stalks, shoving them aside. The man was right behind me, his breathing ragged but steady. Then, the ground shifted beneath me. I stumbled, my foot sinking into the earth. I barely had time to react before hands burst from the soil, clawing at my legs. I screamed. The hands were skeletal, thin, their fingers too long, too sharp. They dragged at me, pulling me down. I kicked, thrashing against them, my heart pounding. "Help!" The man turned, his eyes widening. He lunged forward, grabbing my arm. "Don't let it take you," he yelled. The hands tightened around my ankles, yanking harder. My body jerked downward. The dirt swallowed my legs up to my knees. I clawed at the ground, desperate, my fingers digging into the soft earth. My skin was slick with sweat, my breath coming in panicked gasps. Then, from the darkness below, I heard a whisper. A voice. "Not yet." The hands released me. I tumbled forward, gasping, scrambling away from the hole. My body shook violently, my mind reeling. The man grabbed me, pulling me up. "We need to keep moving." I nodded shakily, my heart still hammering. We ran again, the field stretching endlessly around us. But the whisper stayed with me. Not yet. Not yet. What did it mean? The man pulled me forward, his grip tight. His face was set, his expression unreadable. "What was that?" I managed to say between gasping breaths. He didn't answer right away. Then, "This place doesn't just trap us." I looked at him. "Then what does it do?" He swallowed hard. "It changes us." I opened my mouth to question him further, but before I could, the sunflowers ahead of us ended. We skidded to a stop. A vast, crumbling house stood before us, its wooden frame rotting, its windows dark and empty. The roof sagged inward, as if it had been abandoned for centuries. The door hung slightly open, revealing nothing but blackness inside. My pulse quickened. "Where are we?" I asked. The man exhaled shakily. "This is where it started." I turned to him. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. Then, "This is the house of the man who killed me." His hollow eyes met mine. "And if you're here now—" A slow, creeping horror filled his face. "Then that means you've been here before." My breath caught. The door creaked open wider. The darkness inside seemed to breathe, and then a voice from inside the house, low, raspy, familiar. "Welcome home." The house loomed before us, its rotten wood and shattered windows barely holding together. It felt like a living thing, watching, breathing, waiting. The air around it was heavier, thicker, carrying the scent of damp wood and something far worse: decay. I swallowed hard. My body screamed at me to turn around, to run back into the field, to put as much distance between myself and that voice as possible. But I couldn't move. The voice had been mine. It came from inside the house, low and raspy, like someone who had spent decades whispering secrets into the dark. But worse than the familiarity of it was the tone, welcoming, expectant, as if it had been waiting for me. The man beside me, my killer, my companion in this nightmare, was rigid, his hollow eyes locked on the entrance. "Who the hell is that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look at me. "You already know." A cold shiver ran through me. "That's impossible." He exhaled slowly. "Nothing is impossible here." The words settled over me like a suffocating weight. I turned back to the house. The open door gaped like a wound, revealing nothing but pure, suffocating blackness inside. No flicker of light, no indication of depth, just endless, hungry dark. Then the floorboards creaked. Something was moving inside. I took a step back instinctively. My entire body was screaming at me to run. But the man beside me stood his ground. "I'm not going back in there," he said, voice tight. I turned to him. "You've been inside?" His jaw clenched. "Once." He didn't elaborate. Another noise from within. A slow, deliberate step. The air seemed to grow colder, the weight of the field pressing against my back, as if it, too, was watching. I forced myself to speak. "Then what happens if we don't go in?" He hesitated. Then, for the first time since I met him, I saw something flicker across his face. Fear. His eyes darted toward the field, toward the unseen thing that had been chasing us, and then back to the house. "We don't have a choice." I hated that he was right. Behind us, the sunflowers swayed without wind, their deep blue petals shimmering like oil in the dim light. Something moved within them, hidden, patient. The shadow. It was still out there, and it was waiting. I turned back to the house. The door, once cracked open, now stood wider, as if it knew we had made our decision, as if it was inviting us inside. "Stay close," the man muttered. I followed him up the steps. Each one groaned beneath our weight, the wood splintering under my feet. The air smelled wrong, a mix of mildew, stagnant water, and something bitter, like burnt hair. As we crossed the threshold, the darkness swallowed us whole. Inside, the silence was deafening. The air was thick, heavy, pressing against my skin like a weighted blanket. The walls stretched high, their surfaces covered in something dark. Mold, maybe, or something worse. I could barely make out the shapes of furniture, their outlines warped and unfamiliar. But the worst part? The house was breathing. I could hear it, the slow, rhythmic creaking of the walls, the floor beneath us shifting like stretched skin. The entire structure pulsed, as if it was alive. Then, a whisper. "You came back." My blood turned to ice. The voice was so close, too close, coming from the hallway ahead, where the darkness was thickest. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something there, waiting. I turned to the man. His face was tight, his fists clenched. "Keep moving," he murmured. We stepped forward, deeper into the house. The hallway stretched impossibly long, the shadows swallowing the light. Every step felt wrong, like walking into something's open mouth. The whisper came again, curling around me, like fingers against my skin. "You don't remember, do you?" A flicker of movement ahead. I stopped. There in the dark. A figure. It stood just at the edge of my vision, barely visible in the shifting blackness. The shape was human, but wrong, its limbs just a little too long, its posture slouched, unnatural. My stomach twisted. The man beside me exhaled sharply. "Don't listen to it." The figure took a step closer. The darkness peeled away just enough for me to see its face, and I felt my mind break. It was me, a perfect copy. The same face, the same clothes, the same haunted, wide-eyed expression I was wearing right now. But its eyes, they were empty, hollow, just like the man beside me. I staggered back. "What the hell?" The thing that looked like me smiled. "It gets easier." I barely had time to react before it lunged. I threw myself backward as it rushed me, its fingers curling like claws, its mouth stretching too wide in that horrible, empty grin. The man grabbed my arm, yanking me back. "Run!" he shouted. I didn't think. I just ran. The house twisted around us as we moved, hallways stretching, doors slamming shut before we could reach them. The air hummed as if the walls themselves were speaking. Behind me, my other self laughed. The sound was wrong, a broken, distorted version of my own voice. It was getting closer. I turned a corner, nearly tripping over the warped floorboards. Ahead of us, a staircase stretched downward into pure, suffocating blackness. The man hesitated. "It's a trap," he muttered. The footsteps behind us grew louder, closer. We didn't have a choice. I grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. The two of us tumbled down the stairs, plunging into the dark. For a moment I felt weightless, falling, falling, falling. And then the world shattered. A blinding light erupted around us, tearing through the dark like fire. My stomach lurched as I hit solid ground, gasping for breath. The air was different now, cleaner, colder. I looked up, and my heart nearly stopped. We weren't in the house anymore. We were back in the field. But something was different. The sky above us was no longer grey. It was black, pitch black. And the sunflowers? They weren't blue anymore. They were red. The man sat up beside me, breathing hard. His expression was grim. "We did something," I whispered. He nodded slowly. "Yeah." I swallowed hard, and that's when I realized something else. The whispering had stopped. But the watching hadn't. Something was still out there, and it was waiting. I lay there, breathless, my fingers digging into the damp earth beneath me. The sky overhead was black. Not night, not empty, but void. Like something had peeled away the sky and left nothing in its place. The field of sunflowers stretched endlessly around us, but now they were red. Deep, blood-colored petals with inky black centers that seemed to drink in the darkness. I forced myself to sit up. The man was beside me, staring at the flowers with an expression I couldn't read. "This isn't right," I said, my voice hoarse. He didn't look at me. It never is. A thick silence hung between us. My heart was still racing from what had happened in the house, from the thing that had looked like me. "What was that thing?" I asked. The man exhaled slowly. "A version of you." I turned to him sharply. "That's not an answer." He finally met my gaze, his hollow eyes dark with something unreadable. "It's what you become if you stay here too long." My stomach twisted. I turned back to the field. The red sunflowers swayed in a slow, rhythmic motion, as if breathing in unison. The sight of them filled me with unease. Everything was wrong. I clenched my fists. You said we couldn't leave. The man hesitated. What if we were wrong? I frowned. What do you mean? He ran a hand through his unkempt hair. The cycle, it's always the same. We wake up, we run, we die, we start over. The field is always blue, the house is always waiting, but this, he gestured at the sky, at the flowers. This has never happened before. A cold shiver ran through me. So we changed something. He nodded. Yeah. The realization settled over me like a weight. If the cycle was broken, or at least different, did that mean we had a chance to end it? A gust of wind rustled the red sunflowers, and something about the sound made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the whisper of petals against each other, it was something else buried beneath it. A murmur, the silent screams, the channel of interesting horror stories. If you are new on this channel, then don't forget to subscribe the silent screams and press the bell icon for interesting stories. Before we move on, please donate me in the form of subscribe. Low, faint, like distant voices. I turned to the man. Do you hear that? He didn't answer right away. His face had gone pale. We need to move, he said. The urgency in his voice sent a spike of fear through me. Why? He stood scanning the horizon. Because the cycle is broken. I frowned. Isn't that a good thing? He shook his head. Not if it means something else is waking up. A cold pit formed in my stomach. We started walking, pushing through the sunflowers. The petals felt thicker than before, their texture strangely waxy beneath my fingers. The ground was damp and soft, like something underneath had rotted away. The murmuring grew louder, the whispers bled together, an indistinct chorus of voices just out of reach. Then, the ground moved. I stopped cold. Beneath my feet, the earth shifted, as if something huge had stirred beneath the surface. The man grabbed my arm. Don't stop. I hesitated, but his grip tightened. Move. We started running. The red sunflowers blurred past us, their dark centers seeming to track our movement. The ground twitched again, and this time I felt it. A deep, distant pulse, like a heartbeat beneath the soil. Something was waking up. I tried not to think about what that meant. We ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would collapse beneath me. The whispering never stopped. If anything, it grew. Louder. Closer. Then, ahead of us, the sunflowers ended. I skidded to a stop. We stood at the edge of the field, staring at something neither of us had ever seen before. A door, freestanding, alone, tall and ancient-looking, its wood warped and cracked. Symbols were carved into its surface, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe as I looked at them. The door didn't belong here. And yet somehow it felt right. The man exhaled sharply. That wasn't here before. I swallowed hard. So what do we do? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, we open it. I hesitated. What if... Behind us the ground lurched. A deep, wet crack echoed through the air. I turned sharply, and the field split open. The sunflowers fell away, torn from the ground, as a massive fissure split the earth in two. A chasm, deep and hungry, stretching endlessly into blackness. And from within, the hands. They erupted from the darkness below, hundreds of them, clawing at the edges of the chasm. Pale, skeletal fingers, too long, too sharp, pulling, grasping, crawling. And then I saw them. The people. Or what was left of them. Figures emerged from the pit, their bodies twisted and wrong. Faces half-formed, eyes sunken black, mouths stretching too wide. Their skin was cracked, peeling, revealing something dark underneath. They staggered forward. The whispers became screams. I turned back to the man, panic clawing at my throat. Open the door. He didn't hesitate. He reached for the handle, and the second his fingers touched it, the world shifted. A shockwave tore through the air, sending a violent gust ripping through the field. The red sunflowers withered instantly, curling in on themselves. The ground shuddered beneath me, and I felt it tilt, fall. The door swung open, and behind it, not darkness, not void, but light. Blinding golden light that burned against my eyes, spilling out like a flood. The figures from the pit shrieked, recoiling. The whispers collapsed into silence. The man turned to me, his face illuminated by the impossible glow. "This is it," he said. I stared at the light, my pulse hammering. Somewhere deep inside me, I knew this was the only way out. I turned back to the pit. The figures were watching, waiting. I swallowed hard, then I stepped forward and walked through the door. The moment I stepped through the door, the light consumed me. It wasn't warm, it wasn't cold, it was nothing. I felt weightless, as if my body had dissolved into the glow, my thoughts stretching thin like smoke. I tried to move, to speak, but there was no body to control, no voice to use. I was falling. Then, I hit the ground. The impact wasn't violent, but it was sudden, like I had been dropped from just a few feet above. My body was whole again, my senses snapping back all at once. I gasped, my lungs burning as if I had held my breath for hours, my hands pressed against dirt, cold, damp, real. I blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the new world around me. And when I finally saw where I was, my stomach twisted into knots. It was the field, but not the field. The sunflowers here weren't blue, they weren't red. They were grey. A dull, lifeless grey, their petals brittle and curling inward like dying things. The sky above wasn't black, but it wasn't normal either. It was a hazy, washed-out white, as if all colour had been drained from the world. The air was thick, heavy. Every breath felt like inhaling fog. I turned sharply. The door was gone. My pulse hammered in my ears. No. I spun in a full circle, scanning the horizon, but there was nothing but an endless field of dead grey sunflowers. And no sign of the man. I was alone. A creeping sense of dread coiled around my spine. Had I done something wrong? Was this not the way out? Then, a sound. A fluttering noise, like wings beating against the air. I looked up. Something was moving in the sky. At first I thought they were birds, circling high above. But as my eyes focused, I realized they were too large, their movements too unnatural. They twisted and jerked, their wings bending at impossible angles. They weren't birds, they were watching. My skin prickled with unease. I needed to move. Staying in one place had never been safe before. Why would this be any different? I forced my legs to move, pushing through the brittle stalks of dead sunflowers. Each step felt wrong, as if I were trespassing somewhere I didn't belong. As I walked, the landscape remained the same, an endless stretch of grey, the watchers circling above. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I saw something in the distance, a house. My blood ran cold. It was the house, the same rotting wood, the same shattered windows. But here, in this grey world, it looked even worse, like a corpse left to decay for centuries. The wood was brittle, blackened by time, the roof sagging inward as if it could collapse at any moment. A deep, unsettling feeling settled in my chest. Why was it here? I didn't want to go inside. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run. But there was nowhere else to go. So I walked forward. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The door was already open. I stopped at the threshold, peering into the darkness beyond. The interior was even worse than I remembered. Walls crumbling, floorboards warped and cracked. But what made my skin crawl wasn't the decay. It was the fact that the house was occupied. Figures stood inside, half shrouded in the shadows, dozens of them, motionless, silent. And when my eyes adjusted, I realized something that made my stomach churn. I recognized them. I had seen them before, in the pit. They were the same twisted, incomplete people who had crawled out of the chasm in the red field. But here, in the grey world, they were still. Their faces were half-formed, mouths stretching too wide, their hollow eyes locked on me. Then, in unison, they took a step forward. My breath hitched. I took a step back instinctively, my hands shaking. They stepped forward again. I turned, ready to run. But then something shifted behind me. A whisper, low and familiar. "You don't have to be afraid." I froze. The voice was my own. I turned back to the house, and my blood went cold. One of the figures had stepped ahead of the others, and it looked exactly like me. No twisted features, no hollow eyes, just me, standing there, Watching, it took another step forward. "You don't have to be afraid," it repeated in my own voice. My heart pounded. "What? What are you?" It smiled, and then it spoke again. "I'm the first." I shook my head, confusion clawing at my mind. "The first… what?" It cocked its head. "The first you that died here." I felt my stomach drop. I took another step back, my entire body trembling. "No," I whispered. "That's not possible." It only smiled wider. Behind it, the other figures stared, waiting, and then, in perfect, inhuman unison, they spoke as one. "Join us." The ground beneath me lurched. I stumbled, the air twisting around me like a living thing. The sky darkened, the watchers above growing more restless, their wings beating faster. The figure that looked like me took another step closer. And I ran. I turned and sprinted, shoving through the dead sunflowers, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I could hear them moving, chasing. The house faded into the distance, swallowed by the thick grey air, but the voices followed me, whispering, calling my name. The sunflowers grew taller, their brittle stalks bending as I pushed through. The sky churned, a swirling mass of grey and white. Then, ahead of me, a door. My chest heaved. It was the door, the same freestanding structure as before. But this time it was different. The wood was blackened, cracked, as if burned, and instead of glowing light behind it, there was only darkness. I hesitated. A voice whispered behind me. "There is no escape." I clenched my fists. I didn't know what was behind that door, but I knew what was behind me. I grabbed the handle, and I stepped through. The moment I stepped through the blackened door, the world around me collapsed. A sensation like being pulled apart gripped me, my body twisting through something vast and endless. The air was thick, almost solid, pressing against me as I fell. Or was I rising? I couldn't tell anymore. I squeezed my eyes shut, the weight of everything crashing down on me. Then I landed. But this time I didn't hit the ground. I was standing. The shift was so abrupt that my knees nearly buckled beneath me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to regain my balance. The air here was still, unnaturally so, as if the entire world was holding its breath. I forced myself to look around, and what I saw made my blood run cold. I was in a room, a perfectly familiar room. The walls were peeling wallpaper, stained with time. The wooden floor was warped, the planks uneven and rotting at the edges. A single cracked mirror hung on the far wall, reflecting the dim glow of a flickering light bulb dangling from the ceiling. It was his house. But this time I was inside. I turned, heart pounding, scanning every shadowed corner. It was empty. For now. A cold pit formed in my stomach. Something about this place felt different than before. The decay was deeper, the silence thicker, as if the house itself had been waiting for me. I took a hesitant step forward. The floor creaked beneath my weight, the sound echoing like a warning. I needed to find a way out. I moved cautiously, running my fingers along the cracked walls, searching for anything. A door, a window, something that could take me somewhere else. But as I reached the far end of the room, my fingers brushed against something familiar. Paper. My breath caught in my throat. A note. I grabbed it with shaking hands and brought it close enough to read. The handwriting was mine. "If you're reading this, it's already too late." A sharp chill ran down my spine. I turned the note over, half expecting more words, more answers. But the other side was blank. What did this mean? Too late for what? The air in the room shifted. A soft, almost imperceptible sound reached my ears. Breathing, slow, deep. Behind me, I froze. The mirror. Something was in the reflection. My pulse thundered in my ears. "Don't look, don't look, don't look." But I did, and I wished I hadn't. Because standing in the mirror, just behind me, was him. The man who started the cycle. He wasn't moving, he wasn't speaking, he was just watching. His face was wrong, warped, hollow-cheeked, his eyes like black pits. His mouth was slightly open, as if caught mid-breath. His hands hung limply at his sides, the fingers too long, the nails cracked and peeling. But the worst part, I could feel him. He wasn't just in the mirror, He was right behind me. I spun around, and the room was empty. My chest heaved, cold sweat dripping down my back. My hands trembled as I clutched the note, my mind racing. Number, I wasn't alone. I could still feel him. Watching. Waiting. I turned back to the mirror, and this time my own reflection was missing. A jagged crack split down the center of the glass, and then, without warning, a hand shot out from the mirror. I stumbled backward as his fingers scraped against the air, reaching, stretching, the reflection warping and twisting. The glass shattered outward, shards flying in every direction, and the man stepped through. My breath hitched as he emerged from the broken mirror, his body folding and unfurling in ways that weren't human. His skin was wrong, too stretched, too thin, his limbs moving with an unnatural grace. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The air had thickened, pressing against me like invisible hands, pinning me in place. He stepped closer, and when he finally spoke, his voice was like a blade across my skin. "You took too long." My mouth was dry, my lungs burned. I forced out a whisper. "Too long for what?" His expression didn't change. "To break the cycle." I shook my head, my heart pounding. "I don't understand." "I found the door. I left the field." He took another step forward, his sunken eyes locked onto mine. "You brought it with you." A deep, suffocating dread settled in my chest. "What?" He raised a shaking hand and pointed at me. I stared at him, confusion warring with terror, until I noticed something. The mirror shards, scattered across the floor, reflecting the dim, flickering light. And in their broken, jagged surfaces, I saw myself, or at least I thought I did. But as I looked closer, the reflections weren't the same. Each shard showed something different, a dozen versions of me, shifting, distorting. One was covered in blood. Another was rotting, skin peeling away in strips. Another was crying, eyes hollow and lifeless, and then one of them smiled. But I didn't. The reflection grinned at me, its eyes glinting with something wrong, and then, all at once, they all turned to look at me. I felt my body seize up. My breaths came in short, ragged gasps. The man took another step closer, his voice low. "The cycle isn't something you escape." The reflections moved, shifting and twitching, their faces twisting into grotesque versions of me. "It's something you become." The air collapsed inward, the room spinning, the mirror shards trembling like they were about to burst. And then, the door behind me slammed open. Blinding light poured in, swallowing the darkness. A hand, not mine, not his, grabbed my wrist. And before I could scream, before I could even think, I was pulled through. The world shifted around me. The hand yanked me forward, dragging me through the door. My vision blurred, and for a split second it felt like I was falling through nothingness again. Like before. But this time, something was different. The air was thick, almost buzzing with energy. My body was heavy, my limbs sluggish, like I was moving through deep water. But the grip on my wrist was firm, pulling me forward with purpose. Then, I hit the ground. I gasped, my hand scraping against something soft. Grass. I blinked hard, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of where I was. The world slowly came into focus, and I realized I was in the field again. But not the grey one, not the red one. This one was different. The sunflowers here were a pale, almost ghostly white, their petals shimmering faintly under the overcast sky. The air smelled clean, untouched by the decay of the other worlds. And then I saw them, the figures standing around me. At first, my instincts screamed at me to run, but as I looked closer, I realized these weren't the same hollow, broken things I had seen before. These were people. Like me. They stood in a loose circle, their faces wary but not hostile. Some were older, some younger, their clothes torn and stained, as if they had been here for a long time. Their eyes held the same haunted look I had seen in my own reflection, and then I saw the one who had pulled me through. She was tall, with sharp, watchful eyes. Her dark hair was cut unevenly, as if done in a hurry, and her arms were lined with old scars. She released my wrist and took a step back, studying me. "You made it," she said. Her voice was low, calm, but there was something behind it, something tired. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Who, who are you? She hesitated, glancing at the others before answering. We're the ones who got out. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Got out, I echoed. You mean you were trapped? Like you? Like all of us? My stomach twisted. She gestured to the others. Some of us have been here for years, some for only a short time. But we all ended up in the same place, running from the same thing. The man in the mirror. The cycle. A low murmur rippled through the group as they watched me, cautious but curious. I shook my head, still struggling to process. But how? How did you escape? The woman's expression darkened. That's the thing, she nodded toward the field. We didn't. Not really. A heavy silence settled between us. She turned and started walking, motioning for me to follow. Come on, you need to see something. I hesitated for only a second before trailing after her. The others didn't move, but I could feel their eyes on me. We walked through the field, the ghostly white sunflowers whispering in the wind. And then, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the edge, my breath caught in my throat. The pit was here, but it wasn't the same as before. Instead of a gaping void, this one was different, its edges lined with twisted roots, its surface shimmering like rippling water. The light here was strange, bending and warping, as if the air itself was alive. I took a step closer, my pulse hammering. The woman stood beside me, her face unreadable. This is what's left of the door. I turned to her sharply. Door? She nodded. The original one, the real one, the one that actually led out. A shiver crawled down my spine. And now? Her expression darkened. Now it's broken. I stared at the pit, at the unnatural way the light moved across its surface. Somewhere deep inside, I felt a pull, a faint, gnawing sensation, like something was calling to me. Something inside the pit. I swallowed hard. What happened to it? The woman hesitated, then she exhaled. The cycle happened. I turned to her. She looked me in the eye. You're not the first to try and break it. Her words sent a chill through me. She gestured toward the pit. Every time someone gets close to escaping, it fights back. The house, the mirror, the man. They're all just pieces of it, trying to keep itself intact, to keep itself alive. I shook my head. That doesn't make sense. If it's just a cycle, why would it care? She gave me a long, searching look. Because it's not just a cycle. She nodded toward the pit. It's a prison. The words sent an icy bolt through my veins. A prison. For what? I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, the air shifted. The others, still standing in the distance, tensed. The woman's eyes snapped toward the sky. Damn it! I followed her gaze, and my stomach dropped. The watchers were here, the twisted, writhing things I had seen in the grey field. Dozens of them, hundreds. Their wings bent at impossible angles, their movements jerky and unnatural. And they were descending. The woman grabbed my arm. We have to move, now. Panic clawed at my throat. Where do we go? She didn't answer. She just ran. I followed, my heart hammering as the air filled with whispers, low guttural voices, too many to count, speaking in unison. The sky darkened, the wind howled. The cycle wasn't done with me yet. I ran. I didn't look back, but I could feel it. Something old, something hungry. And it was coming for me. We ran. The watchers shrieked above us, their voices like a chorus of broken whispers. The sky churned with their movement, a sea of twisted wings and hollow eyes, shifting too fast, moving too wrong. The others had already scattered, disappearing into the pale sunflowers, their figures swallowed by the endless field. Only the woman, my guide, remained ahead of me, pulling me forward with a desperation I didn't fully understand yet. And then, the ground split open beneath us. I barely managed to stop myself from falling into the gaping blackness that had erupted in our path. The pit was alive, twisting and churning with something thick and unfamiliar, as if the very earth was trying to consume us. She skidded to a stop, cursing under her breath. We're running out of time, she hissed. I turned to look behind me, and immediately wished I hadn't. The watchers were closer now, their forms pulsed and flickered, their bodies losing shape, shifting between things they had been before. They weren't just watchers. They were those who had failed, and they were becoming part of the cycle. I felt my stomach twist as I saw glimpses of faces I recognized, twisted, distorted reflections of people who had been just like me, their mouths open in silent screams as they melted into the darkness. A fate worse than death. I turned back to the woman. What do we do? She hesitated, just for a moment, then her jaw clenched. There's only one way to break it. She turned and faced the pit. You have to go in. I recoiled. What? She didn't look at me. Her eyes stayed locked on the swirling void beneath us. It's the only way. No, I shook my head. That doesn't make sense. If I go in, I'll just... You won't come back. The words hit like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, trying to understand. Then, how does that help? She finally turned, and the look in her eyes was haunted. Because that's the only thing the cycle doesn't expect. My breath caught in my throat. The cycle, she said, voice low, urgent, needs you to keep coming back. That's how it survives. It feeds on the loop, on people like us, dying and waking over and over again. But if you go into the pit, willingly, you don't come back. I felt something cold crawl up my spine. You end it. I looked down at the pit. The void rippled, almost expectant. I took a step back. I can't. She grabbed my wrist. You have to. I shook my head, panic rising in my chest. There has to be another way. There isn't. The words were sharp, final, and I knew she was right. I looked at the watchers, still closing in, their twisted, writhing forms now close enough to touch. If I hesitated, I would become one of them. A new piece of the cycle. A new monster to hunt the next me. I turned back to the pit. My whole body trembled. I don't want to die. She looked at me with something soft in her expression. I know. A single breath. A single step. I let go. And I fell. The darkness swallowed me whole. The cycle shattered. I felt it break, splintering apart like a mirror smashing into a million pieces. The weight of every past life, every death, every loop cracked and dissolved, collapsing under its own impossible weight. The watchers screamed, not in hunger, but in agony. Because they were dying. No, they were being set free. The darkness around me shifted, twisted, then folded inward, compressing into something infinitely small before disappearing altogether. And then, silence, pure, still. I opened my eyes, and I was somewhere new, not the field, not the house, not the inescapable limbo of death and rebirth. I was free. I exhaled, a real solid breath, one that didn't belong to someone else's borrowed body. For the first time in 30 days, I was alive, and I was finally myself.